Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for October of 2022. I listened to 11 new albums over the last month and I'm going to talk about those albums. We got time codes in the description. A lot of new stuff, not a whole lot of backlog was really spun, but it was a lot of good stuff. So let's go ahead and get started.
Harry, you're no good alone. Why are you sitting at home on the floor?
Now, obviously, even though this is my first time talking about Harry Styles, I'm not new to his music. I've heard singles from Sign of the Times and Fine Line. I'm dating a One Direction fan, so I've heard a lot of their stuff in the last 5 years that I hadn't heard any time prior, and also because of that, I have also seen some of his points where he's trying to break out of the music scene and try acting, but I won't comment about that. Instead, Harry's House more serves as sort of vindication for the assumptions I'd had as somebody who wasn't a Harry Styles fan wholeheartedly going into his music. And that it's fine, if not a bit bland, but Harry's House does have some moments that stand above some of the mediocrity I was expecting when going into this project. Sure, this album's focus isn't clean, big, bombastic pop. There are still some good hooks on here. You know, obviously the singles on here have continued to stay in the singles chart for a reason. While I do see some of the complaints for tracks like Music for a Sushi Restaurant sounding a bit too cleanly produced, I think, and honestly, that flat cleanness kneecaps some of the sonic ideas that song has going on. I'm a sucker for that chord progression, and I like that groove, but I feel like the bass doesn't pop enough, those horns don't pop enough in the chorus. I feel like in a live setting, it would sound great, and the clips from the live shows I've seen featuring this that I think is the opener to his live show, I think sounds a lot better in a live setting than it does on the record. Late Night Talking also feels just kind of like a song that is riding tropes that have been kind of dying off in pop, but doing them in the flattest way possible. And as it was, while I think it is the strongest single here, sticks out amidst some of the points on the record that are trying to tap into that same minimal throttling groove that song has at its core. You know, for as much as I like Grape Juice and Daydreaming, they both illustrate moments where, whether from a production perspective or a performance perspective, the song is held back by something that a track like As It Was just isn't. I also think the pacing of this album just feels a bit too compartmentalized. There's similar tracks next to each other, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but leads to moments like Little Freak and Matilda that could feel a little more poignant and purposeful had they been put apart at different points on the record. I don't hate Little Freak, but I think that it definitely feels non-important once Matilda creeps in, a song that is much stronger from a compositional and songwriting perspective. I think the pairing of the acoustic guitars and the vocal layering on that track is really well done, and even that bleeding into a track that I don't think comes off of it very well. Cinema, another groove-centric track that I think works, illustrates that harsh juxtaposition that's happened with the sequencing that this album has going on with it. And while the minimalism at its core leads to a handful of moments that just feel like they aren't fully pulled together, tracks like Satellite do showcase where those ideas get to shine in a better facet. You know, it's weird. I think that this album's fine for what it is, and definitely showcases a bit more than I was even maybe expecting walking into a Harry Styles album in full. But even then, I still don't think that this is all that strong as far as showcasing any sort of bombast dynamic artistry, any consistent songwriting, and even some of the hook work on here isn't consistently strong across the board. This album's fine for what it is, but it's very average at its core. Its highlights, being as strong as they are, set it above a 5 for me. I'm putting it at a 6. But this album, by and large, still doesn't really wow me in a lot of the ways that I wasn't expecting it to. You know, I was kind of walking in thinking it was going to be a normal pop album, and it pretty much is, in my opinion.
Dark blood red void carries.
You know, until this album came out, I was kind of surprised Bjork sat out 2020, a time where everyone was getting kind of introspective and breaking down their own isolation, something that I think Bjork would have done incredibly well, especially given Volnicura and Utopia saw her doing a sort of bounce back from love while mourning the loss of it incredibly well. However, once spinning Fossora, the reason why Bjork set out 2020 made all the more sense, because she's aiming for bolder things she wants to tackle and deconstruct, like womanhood and the trials and trappings seen therein. And given we're in a time right now, especially in America, where that's kind of a scary thing to be, I think she handles it incredibly well. I think that she also does a good job at doing what she does best in readapting her experiments and her own eras, as it were, into this cocktail of excellence that is the soundscape of this. You know, while tracks like a Topos and Ovule see her sort of continuing the thread seen from Utopia, I like that she really quickly pivots that into more sincere, deep-rooted introspection, which makes sense given not only does this album sort of sonically have this organic meets mechanical feel, with the brass seemingly pulling away from the orchestral section of Utopia and creating this low-end organic rumble that has the sense of regality to it. She melds that beautifully with the almost ethereal ambience of Post, with the abrasive electronics of an album like Homogenic, masterfully. You know, these tracks like Mycelia and Trollagaba do more to add to the sonic tapestry with these use of Bjork's vocals that feel like she's pulling from what she did with her time with Death Grips for the On the Moon side of the powers that be. Trollagaba in general has this foreboding tone to it that I think is excellent. You know, I think that the pacing of this album, the sequencing of this album feels just as purposeful, because after she sort of starts by looking at love and her place in it, she immediately goes inward with Sorrowful Soil and Ancestress, two songs that talk about motherhood and womanhood and talking about the female experience by and large, focusing on the ticking time clock that is being a woman and sort of the pressure seen observance-wise from the outside world within. You know, I think that it's poignant that those songs go into this beautiful rendition of an Icelandic poem, Fjordum. I know I didn't pronounce that right, so thank you, Google Translate. Before going into an observance of that reflection and that place that you're in with victimhood, I think that the melding of those ideas with this fungal imagery across the board and these allegories of digging deeper and forming roots is tied together beautifully. This feels like what a lot of really good Bjork albums are, in that it's well thought out, it's well written, it's got this overall, not mission statement, but thematics it wants to explore, not even just from a lyrical perspective, but in an allegorical sense, masterfully. I like this record a lot. I think it's another really good notch and Bjork's belt. I feel like if you enjoy some of the sounds she's explored with on her 90s catalog and you want to see them sort of melded together with some of the newer ideas she's toyed with, I would listen to this album. I think it's really good. It's not my favorite, but I think it's better than her last couple of records for sure. I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. I think that it's equal parts beautiful and haunting at the same time, and it shows that Bjork still got it. She still ain't lost it. She's still knocking top-notch stuff out of the park, and I'm happy to see it. Now, that me covering this album may not make a whole lot of sense to some people, because, well, I've never really shown much of an interest in Alter Bridge on this channel. I reviewed Tremonti's last album. I gave it kind of meddling reception, and yeah, I didn't walk into this Pawns and Kings album with the highest of expectations, because, well, I used to listen to Alter Bridge back in the day, because obviously I also listened to Creed, because I was a white guy in the 2000s who listened to rock and metal music. But this Alter Bridge album kind of gave me what I was expecting. Pretty competent playing from the band. Miles Kennedy's voice gets to soar. I was surprised to see that it took him this long for Tremonti to also have vocals added to the mix, because I think the two of them's vocals work pretty amicably together, but I feel like this album's biggest problem is none of that. It's all fine. It all works well enough, and it's solid in some instances. Some of the solo work on tracks like Dead Among the Living and Silver Tongue. Some of the lead work on Fable of the Silent Sun and Last Man Standing is pretty solid on its own as well. This album just has this problem where none of its ideas really lend themselves to being drawn out to the lengths that they are in this record, and the band themselves doesn't really do much to make those ideas enticing across like a 6.5 minute or an 8-minute runtime in the case of Fable of the Silent Sun. A song that really tries to play with these prog-style movements, but the band themselves, even though I feel like they're talented enough to pull it off, doesn't. They instead rely pretty heavily on these tepid, mid-tempo, just big riff sections that are tied together with these solo sequences that I don't think are all that compelling to listen to. And there's these lyrics on Sin After Sin and Dead Among Living that land to the gravitas that the band is playing with. Fun enough. It's just, again, not stuff that I typically go to this style of music for. Sure, again, there are points where this album hits a good stride. You know, I think the softer moments stay into the more, you know, heavier adjacent holiday following the crawl of Sin After Sin is a nice touch. I think the leads of Last Man Standing go really well into the title track's grandness, but even moments like that still feel kneecapped by some of the complaints that I have. I feel like if you like rock music or you are a fan of this band, you're gonna like stuff that this album has, and you may even appreciate some of the new ideas that they're trying to experiment with on this project. I just don't normally go to this type of music, so it's not normally a type of music that I indulge in all that intensely. This album's fine though, it's not bad, it's just average. I'm giving it a 5 out of 10, not quite my cup of tea, fully, but I like some of what's here. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't the most excited for this Lamb of God album, Omens. I didn't like the lead single title track all that much. I thought it was kind of similar to their self-titled album, a bit less exciting than a lot of their stuff that came out prior to that. But I'll be honest, Omens actually feels like the band pulling it all together and feeling like a cohesive unit once again in a way that their self-titled album just didn't have going on at its core. It's funny, I liked this album so much, I threw on that self-titled immediately after to see if I was just being too harsh on it at the time, and almost immediately, I was just kind of turned away. Whereas this album, while it's got some ideas adapted from that self-titled, like, more prominent use of Randy doing clean vocals, at their core, the band just pulls together the tunes a lot more consistently on this project. They feel more like themselves again in a way that the last album felt like more of a Growing Pains experience. You know, the stomping groove on Nevermore, the opener, lends really well into the throttling pocket of Vanishing and Into the Grave. While tracks like Ditch and Omens see them sort of resting on their laurels a bit too heavily, the riff work on Ditch, at least, is still as electrifying as ever, while Gomorrah still sees them trying to adapt some of the sounds from their self-titled into their brand of metal music. I think it comes across a little bit smoother on there. Hell, the build-up on Ill Designs evokes the same feeling that I got from records like Wrath in the best way possible. I got so into the breakdowns on this project that it was really nice to feel again as a longtime fan of this band. And hell, tracks like Denial Mechanism see them sort of adapting what some would see as some of their roots into their current era. And I think that it comes across pretty gracefully. I don't know, this album is far more consistent and solid than anything that was on their self-titled album, and I think that it is a much stronger effort by and large. It's getting a 7. I think that it's very, very solid. There's some moments that feel a bit too idiosyncratic, but by and large the band feels like they're a lot tighter, they're a lot more focused. The songs don't have any moments where they linger in the ways that they did on the last album, and overall, I feel like this is a much better experience by and large, in my opinion.
Ain't no solving no murders, welcome to Murderland. Send a hit and scratch off a hit, bitch, I'm the murder man.
Freddie Gibbs' Soul Sold Separately sees him tying together this theme of burning through your label budget in a penthouse to make a project about your drug raps in a way that only Freddie Gibbs can pull off pretty amicably, I feel like. This album is equal parts pretty impressive and not as impressive as what I've heard from Freddie in the past. I got to be a fan of him through his producer-centric collaborations like Alfredo and the stuff he's done with Madlib, And I feel like those albums accent Freddie's ability to work well with a producer in creating some really good tracks. And while this album still sees him pulling off some pretty good tracks, I like Blackest in the Room and Zipper Bags well enough. I think CIA is definitely the peak out of the solo Freddie stuff. I think the beat on there is pretty solid. I think the imagery on there and the word spinning is similar to some of the highs seen with some of the collaborations. And I kind of just wish there was more of that from Freddie amidst some of the rabid interludes and thematics and concept that the album's trying to spin as a whole. I think Offset and Moneybagg Yo do a good job at bridging the gap for Freddie Gibbs well enough, but Anderson .Paak and Raekwon on Feel No Pain, an incredible song that highlights sort of the apex of some of the sadness and darkness seen in some of the lyrics, with Gold Rings being the sort of cocaine team-up you would expect with these two, and I think it comes across fantastically. And PYS is a pretty good collaboration with DJ Paul. I just kind of wish Freddie was delivering consistently on the caliber that the features are. And I also wish that the deluxe edition was the standard edition, because there's some collaborations on there that I think come across and they pull away from some of the rabbit tracks that coat this album a bit too heavily in the standard edition. I don't know, I liked this album, but I definitely wanted more from Freddie, from the production, and from the overall thematics as a whole. But given the highlights and the parts that I do think shine both Freddie and collaborative otherwise, I'm giving this album a 7. It's solid, I like it, I like the collaborations, by and large. I think the production's pretty solid, if not a bit bland at points, and while I think it gets too bogged down in trying to, hammer in its story or its concept, I think that when it does pull away from that, Freddie does deliver on some pretty great tracks by and large. Now you guys could have guessed I was probably excited for this new Boston Manor album, Datura, because they were great at Riot Fest. They had hyped up the album amidst that set. They played the new songs ripped live as much as they did in studio. I think that the new songs are better than anything that was really on Glue for the most part. It felt like more of a building of bridges between the even more infectious chorus work that was in Glue, in with some of that edge that coated Welcome to the Neighborhood a little more intensely. And this album does all of that full stop. I think that this is a stronger batch of songs cohesively than anything on Glue. I think the flow of it is pretty well constructed. The two singles right next to each other are a little wonky, but I think that breaking up the album's flow, though as tight as it is, just it's fine where it's at. The chorus work is great. Floodlights on the Square hits a really good high. Crocus carries the groove of Passenger. We're adding some good edge to it that I think works incredibly well. I love the sounds and the bass and the chorus of that song. There's a really good use of production on there that I think the band harnesses fantastically. I think Inertia really carries the listener with a great fucking hook. That, the vocals on that song just soar, and the ambience that creeps in there enhances some of the ambience heard on tracks like Shelter from the Rain, which is a good sort of dissection from the intensities. Same with the opening sort of parts of the title track and Floodlights on the Square. This album's biggest problem is that it stops there. The end of Inertia feels like it's building up to something explosive. It feels like that inertia is throttling the listener into another fucking full court, half court swish. And it ends Amazing Spider-Man 2 style. It's really upsetting to me. I know that I'd heard the band is dropping the second half of this early next year, but if that's the case, I'd have waited a couple of months to hear the rest of this, because this batch of songs are much better, and I would be happy giving this even more praise if there were more here. This is I feel like I'm listening to the demo disc version of an album experience, and it's all the more frustrating every time I throw it. I've come back to this album this Pocket project more than anything else I heard this month. And there were a couple of other Pocket projects that I really liked that I'll talk about very shortly. But those Pocket projects, even by comparison, feel all the more satisfying and full than what Boston Manor brought to the table with this. I want to give this such high praise because I think concisely this is just a good concentrated dose of Boston Manor. But similarly to like Earl Sweatshirt and IDK's newest projects, they just feel like they are cutting themselves way too fucking short. This could be the best album that Boston Manor have ever pulled together with how good this batch of songs is, but it feels like I'm just getting like the sampler platter with the other stuff being held behind this fucking curtain that I can't even see through. I don't know. Obviously, I'll be combining this with that at some point in a show that I do, but as it stands right now, I wanted to give this a 6. I really did, because I think that this album is so criminally short, but the songs here are so good that I think that they are all better than Glue collectively. So I'm giving it a 7. I gave Glue a 6. I still think that's a solid enough rating for that album. I'm going to give this a 7, which would retroactively make Welcome to Our Neighborhood a little bit better. But this is just so much potential that just ends way too fast. If you like Boston Manor, give this a spin. I think it's a really good album that just begs for so much more.
I know this ain't God.
Case in point, this new Field Medic album, Grow Your Hair If You're Wanting to See Something That You Can Change, is only about 10 seconds longer than the Boston Manor album, yet feels all the more like a fully realized experience that has a definitive start and end. I like this album more and appreciate it feeling more like an experience than the Boston Manor album because of that as well. I also think this album sits above some of the ideas explored on Floral Prince, Field Medic's last album that was dropped back in 2020. I think that there is a definite increase in production value on here that lets some really cool instrumental palettes flourish out, like the intimate yet layered Always Emptiness that sets the bleak stage lyrically that the album thrives at its core incredibly well. A lot of this album revolves around death of oneself. There's, again, some really dark, depressive, bleak places lyrically that Field Medic expresses on here. You know, Weekends, the song after Always Emptiness, the, slow, methodical opener, carries that sadness into a more isolated stance. You know, while Always Emptiness has this sort of self-destructive, explosive bleakness to its lyrical palette, Weekends takes it to a more sad place, dreading the weekends because it's a time when you feel the most alone, because it's the time where you feel the most removed from the people around you. Everyone else is out there living their lives and you aren't. You're just waiting for the slow embrace of death to creep its way around to you. And I like that death permeates out from that in some observations of the outside world in the form of I Had a Dream That You Died. That also extended into I Think About You All the Time. 2 songs where Field Medic talks about somebody that he's thinking about, but in ways that are not quite the same. Yet both also reintroduce an aspect of his sound that kind of tapered off from Floral Prince that I think is handled better here than it did on some of the other earlier projects of his, and that's bringing that beat tape aesthetic that he carried into his live setting and brought into albums like Fade Into Dawn, but I feel like with the nicer production blends it well into the dense, layered, or nuanced arrangements that he pulls onto here with some of the banjo work that crops up on here. The beat tape instrumental synthetics don't feel that starkly contrasted because of how well they're blended together in the mix. And I think that I Had a Dream That You Died and I Think About You All the Time do a good job at bookending these pockets of momentum that the album has going on, because I Had a Dream That You Died ramps things up, kinetically a little bit with the beat while having these lyrics that are still really sad before going into Noonday Sun, another song that has a nice groove at its core while retaining that bleakness. It's in a little bit of a different fashion. It's not just feeling empty, it's not just dreading the weekend, it's wishing to die amidst the middle of the day. waiting for death's embrace at any waking moment. Again, really bleak record, but I love the way that it's pulled together. I think some of that spinning into the split chorus work, like on Miracle Marigold, the way that he flips those choruses into the split song format, I think is beautiful, and I think it's really well done, and I think that it bleeds really well into the split song closer. I Had My Fun, Back to the Start, which sees that beat tape foundation getting melded with some nice ambience beautifully. I think this album is really well constructed. I'm so glad I caught Field Medic at a live show, because I've loved following his discography, and I think that this new album is another great notch in his belt. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I know I really like Floral Prince for shaking it up, but I like how well this fuses that shake-up in with what drew me into him in the first place, and I feel like if you're still sleeping on Field Medic, don't. He does a really good job at melding lo-fi singer-songwriter, folk, acoustic stuff with some alt-country ideas and some lo-fi slacker beat tape stuff that like early Beck did, but keep that sincere twist that an artist like Beck explored in the 2000s.
I need to try a new approach again to really know how it's supposed to sound. This one, I'm in the
Open Mike Eagle was the last Pocket project I checked out this month, and it sees Open Mike Eagle bouncing from his own self-help and self-care into tributes to the past in ways that I feel are as obscurely pulled together as I would expect from Open Mike Eagle. This project is, while brief in runtime, dense with really good verbiage, while also staying truly dedicated to its, traditional homage to lo-fi beat tapes and old school tape making with hip-hop that I think is well pulled together. The instrumental palette of this fits it so very well. Beat after beat on this project is low, loose, and well constructed. I think that he does a good job at balancing reflection and nostalgia through his own scope, like on 79th and Stony Island, which feels like a juxtaposition of innocence with the loss of innocence. Some imagery that also gets reinforced and brought up again on Crenshaw and Homeland, whose piano beat adds to the bleak forebodingness that the future could have been. For Doom sees him paying homage to Doom while reflecting on some of the collaborations he did, putting Doom up on the same monolithic scope that people like myself have also done. He also leans into nostalgia through the guise of imagery, like on Multi-Game Arcade Cabinet, which is a great collaboration with Rap Ferreira and Still Rift, who also come together really well on Circuit City, which sees Mike talking about his place as a part of the culture. I'll Fight You sees him penning just some really good bars. Kites is another track where Video Dave and Still Rift also pull together a really good collaboration with Mike. I enjoy Arm & Hammer and Aesop Rock on here as well, as far as other alternative rappers coming in and really working well with Mike on their own respective tracks. I think that this project, by and large, while, brief in runtime, does what a good Pocket project does in providing a really good, concentrated dose of what the artist in question has to offer. And I feel like conceptualizing it in the same way that an artist like Doom would do on a project of his helps make this project all the more refined and unified as a whole. Even giving Serengeti his own interlude, a la what certain artists would do on Credits interlude, which just has this really nice chiptune style beat, which again, coming off a Multi-Game Arcade Cabinet, kind of feels fitting, adds to the sort of looseness that this album has at its core, and yet it never feels unfocused. It never feels like it diverts off too much. Everything sits in this really nice realm, and I think Mike brought together a fucking awesome project on here. And by and large, while I don't think it's his best project, I certainly think it is still a really strong outing from Mike, and still stands as a really strong hip-hop release in a year that, once again, has been stacked with some dope shit. This is getting an 8 out of 10. I feel like if you are a fan of alternative hip-hop and you haven't given Mike a chance, maybe throw this on. Again, it's a Pocket project. It's a good, concise experience that may not be the sole time Mike has done this, it's a good proof of concept and a good showcase of Mike's ability to rein in some cool thematics and ideas into a very concentrated dose. If you guys remember back in 2019, there were a couple bands that were tapping into this like space jazz aesthetic, and they were doing it incredibly well. And The Comet Is Coming was a band that I discovered throughout a couple of those records that I thought was really promising. I liked the EP they dropped after that album's release, and I'd been anticipating them dropping a follow-up. And this follow-up, Hyperdimensional Expansion Beam, I think weaves the two core ideas of this group together even more harmoniously. You know, this band, which is a jazz group out of the UK, weave this tight jazz band sound, a really good rhythm section with some good brass and sax that come in there, with these synthesized ideas, whether they are droning or kinetic, and create this marriage of the two that I think on this project in particular especially just hits an incredible momentum. This album definitely is a bit more focused, and a handful of the tracks on here are really just mostly about embodying a good groove and carrying a good rhythm. You know, I just think that the band dances around jazz rhythm and dance with electronic rhythm and dance seamlessly in a way that is impeccable. And I think that their choices of synths and where they bring their other instruments in just work so much better on here as well. The opener Code sets a good stage before switching it up and flipping into a little more of a modern style with Technicolor incredibly well. I think Lucid Dreamer through Pyramids is an impeccable 3-track flurry. You know, the groove on Lucid Dreamer carries really well into the meltdown of Tokyo Nights that then kicks off into this just thudding bass on Pyramids that their sax dances with incredibly well. I love the synth tones amidst those 3 tracks, and I think that it's an incredible pocket that the band rides well before settling into some nice drones amidst Frequency of a Feeling Expansion and Angel of Darkness, which has this foreboding tone to it that both synthetically and live instrument-wise pair really well in heightening the listener's anxiety ever so slightly. You know, you're still stuck in the vacuum of space after all, before you hit some good, again, meldings of both worlds, whether it's atomic wave dances, again, another 4 on the floor style, electronic groove. I love Mystic's hi-hat driven percussion on there as well, and I think that the band picks up a really good rhythm on there, and they really find this incredible sound on that track. I think one of the weaker moments on here does come in the back end with the hammer. I like the saxophone on there, but I don't think it dances well with the lead synths in the way that a lot of the record has, throttling at its core so fantastically. But I think by and large this album is incredible. I love a lot of what's here. It is a definite top tier contender for me this year. But you know, I'm a sucker for a good jazz project. I'm a sucker for a good synth project. And this happens to do both fantastically. This is getting a 9 out of 10. Great project for me personally. I feel like if you like those ideas and you want to see them done well, look no further than this Comet Is Coming project. While Taylor Swift spent her last couple of records dissecting herself from her songwriting and more working on character pieces and collaborating with artists that sort of remove her solely from the pop realm, Midnights is very much a bounce back into that territory and sees her fusing some of the soft synthetics and more hook-driven ideals and imagery style from an album like 1989 with some of the modern ideals seen on Reputation without a lot of what made Reputation a really bad experience. Midnights sees Taylor reflective once again, but with Jack Antonoff creates an album that very much evokes the feeling of Midnight by and large. You know, a lot of the instrumental palette of this is hazy, which is apropos given the opener, Lavender Haze. But there's a lot of synthetic ambience that coats a lot of this project, which to its credit does, again, evoke that feeling of midnight very well and suits the sort of reflective style of songwriting Taylor's writing with on here. You know, she does a lot of word spinning and rhyme spinning in ways that lean into Reputation a bit, like on tracks like Anti-Hero and Question and Vigilante shit, but the ambience helps create an experience that isn't as jerky as it could had it had some more straightforward percussion-based production, like on some of the lower points of 1999 Reputation. Does it still lead to some clumsy handwriting? Hell yes it does. Anti-Hero, by and large, even though it is the lead single from this, has some moments that have been very well memed, but also just feel very rough. The pre-chorus of the first chorus, I think, has a cool idea, but is executed better on the second pre-chorus, where she sort of spins the words in a different way. There's the baby, sexy baby monster line that everyone's been talking about. And that's not the only instance like that. I also think Vigilante Shit is a song where the songwriting could go that much harder. It feels a lot more tame than the title Vigilante Shit would evoke. I also feel like some of that ambience lingers for a bit too long and kneecaps some of the stronger moments on here. You know, I feel like You're On Your Own Kid begs for a high-pass filter to creep in and create this sense of foundation that the song doesn't quite meet. And while I think this constant haziness does lend to moments like the closer, especially Mastermind, to feel all the more punctual, it just makes me want more out of the record by the time Mastermind comes around, because that song is also incredibly well put together, but there just aren't enough moments like it on this for me to say I love it nearly as much as her last two records. Do I like this album, though? Yeah, I still think it's a step above Lover. It's more consistent than records like Lover. It does meet it on tracks like Midnight Rain or on Question especially. I love the evolving sound of that song, but I feel like it doesn't crop up on the album quite enough. You know, while I like tracks like Maroon and Snow on the Beach sans its sort of clumsy chorus, I think that when this album hits a good stride, it taps into the same highs that I see more in records like in 1999 in a really nice way. It just kneecaps itself and leaves it short, just shy of some of the highs I've seen Taylor reach from a songwriting and song construction perspective by and large. This album is still solid. It's still getting a 7. I'd argue it's the most solid album in Taylor Swift's discography because the highs here do hit a good stride. I just have never wanted more from an album that feels like it's trying to give me a decent amount in chunks. But I feel like if the more is going to potentially sound like some of the lows on her pop records, I'll stick to feeling complacent in the ambiguity in pockets. This may sound maybe strange to some that only loosely follow the Pixies, but I've kind of been curious to see how Doggerel was going to come together, because I've had this theory lingering in the back of my mind, and I kind of mentioned it during my Beneath the Eerie review, but I think that the Pixies are sort of retroactively finding themselves as consistent as they used to be with each subsequent release from their comeback. I didn't really like Indie Cindy, but I've enjoyed each record of theirs a little more post their comeback. I thought Head Carrier, while still not that strong in pockets, was better than Indie Cindy. I actually really liked Beneath the Eerie, and it has some Pixie songs that I still have on rotation now. And Doggerel feels like more of the same. It just feels like them continuing to reach a point where they're gonna be as good as Trompe Le Monde at the very least. You know, and I feel like with parts of this record, especially runs of this record, I feel like at least they get relatively close. I don't listen to Trompe Le Monde as much as their other first run of their career, but I like a handful of tracks on here. I think that it definitely gets off on a strong foot. I think No Matter Day has some good bite to it that feels like it's vintage Pixies in a modern sense. I think the leads and dregs of Wine kind of evoke the same vibe of Beneath the Eerie, just kind of extended in a different realm that I really enjoy. I think Haunted House does the same thing, but with some nice balladry. I like that song a decent amount. While Get Simulated is a moment that feels like it's trying to, similarly to one of the tracks from Head Carrier, interpolate ideas, or at least melodies, from a Pixies classic in a modern sense, this time Wave of Mutilation, it feels a little less derivative than parts of Head Carrier in a way that I kind of enjoy. I also think the tightness in There's a Moon On evokes the same feeling that Bossa Nova era Pixies did in a quality way. I don't know, everything about this project just kept me coming back in a way that I was happy to say about the Pixies. Again, I think this album is incredibly solid. The production, similarly to Beneath the Eerie, I think works really well with the band. I think the bass pops and keeps the groove locked. I think the guitars both crunch and ring depending on the situation. The mood feels consistent. Black Francis doesn't sound as bad vocally as he did on Beneath the Eerie, and I think that this is actually a more stronger outing from him by and large. I think that this album is surprisingly solid, maybe? While I like the crunch in Thunder and Lightning, and I think that the chorus works really well, that's a moment where both components don't quite mesh as well as other parts of the project, but that's still a really strong song in my opinion. I don't know people's general feeling on the Pixies now, but I like this. I like this a decent amount. Do I think I'll revisit it as much as Beneath the Eerie? No. For some reason, that album just kind of has its hooks in me. But I do like Doggerel a decent amount, and I think that, it reaches highs that keep me invested in this long-standing classic band. This album is getting a 6. It is very, very solid. It has moments that I feel like, again, could see the band reaching highs that they had back in the day. Maybe not early back in the day, but around their dissolvement. Again, this is further bridging both eras of their discography masterfully. And that was what I listened to in October. Have you heard any of these albums? Do you like them? Let me know your thoughts on them, or anything you'd like for me to check out in the segment in the comments down below. If you did like this video, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons if you want to join the ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community. It's linked in the description. Thank you again so very much for watching. I have been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.